Einstein's Gravity, Part 2. Why Einstein's theory of general relativity is wrong. A short background on general relativity. According to the narrative, Einstein, after having published his paper on special relativity in 1905, began thinking of incorporating gravity into his new relativistic framework. In 1907, he began with a simple thought experiment involving an observer in a free fall. It took him 8 years of searching for a relativistic theory of gravity. By 1912, Einstein was actively seeking a theory in which gravity was explained as a geometric phenomenon. With the help of his friend Marcel Grossmann, he was introduced to Riemannian geometry. Further still, with the help of Tullio Levi-Civita, he was introduced to the use of tensors. In 1915, Einstein published his theory of general relativity. What happened in the intervening years between 1907 and 1912? In 1907, Einstein framed gravity with his idea of inertial frame of reference based on his theory of relativity, which is, the laws of physics is the same in a standstill and in a moving frame of reference, this being that gravity feels the same as standing still on the surface of the earth, and being propelled up inside an elevator with the feet pressed on the floor. Between 1907 and 1912, Einstein's attention was on gravity, such as explaining how the moon orbit around the earth. That being, rotating motion is a form of acceleration. Einstein, with the help of his friend Michel Bessot, looked at whether rotation could be considered a form of relative motion. That is, an observer that is rotating and thus experiencing inertia. Where is the relativity in general relativity? Einstein's general relativity can be divided into two parts. On the first part, he thought that standing still on the surface of the earth with the feet pressed on the ground feels the same as being in an elevator accelerating up with the feet pressed on the floor of the elevator. On the second part, he associated rotation as a form of relative motion, and with his fabric of space-time being bent by the mass, he made the moon fall in acceleration in a geodesic curve around the earth. The structure of the general relativity. Descartes' plenum vortex and Newton's bucket. I had not known of any direct evidence that Einstein borrowed Descartes' plenum vortex as his idea of how the heavenly bodies are in orbit, but then Einstein was active in the field of cosmology. But for sure Einstein was familiar with Newton's bucket, as there was an argument on this by Ernst Mach regarding absolute rest and absolute motion. Einstein was influenced by Ernst Mach regarding his understanding of inertia. The idea of Newton's bucket was discussed in Newton's Principia, which can be found not in the general scholium as most articles noted, but rather in scholium at the end of the definitions, proving again that most writers do not bother to verify their sources in the same way that most people had never even carefully read Galileo's book, concerning the two chief world systems, Copernican and Ptolemaic, where Einstein supposedly got his relativity. The idea of Newton's bucket is that of a bucket with water on it that is suspended in the air. Whether the bucket is rotated or the water is rotated, the water will form a concave shape with the edge of the water climbing up the wall of the bucket. Newton's discussion of the Newton's bucket was rather regarding the argument on absolute motion or relative motion. What seems to have had happened was that Einstein adapted Newton's bucket in his theory of general relativity and made the surface of the water become the fabric of space-time. Most books and articles often wrote that Einstein had relinquished the existence of ether. Michelson and Morley's experiment on detecting the existence of ether was done in 1895, and it was known that Einstein was aware of its result, being that it did not prove the existence of ether. In 1905, Einstein in his special relativity paper dismissed the concept of ether as superfluous. What happened was that in Einstein's general relativity, he concluded that the gravitational potentials in his theory characterized the physical qualities of empty space and served as a medium that could transmit disturbances. Einstein began referring to this as a new way to conceive of an ether. In 1916, he wrote to Lorentz, "I agree with you that general relativity theory admits of an ether hypothesis." In May 1920 lecture in Leiden, Einstein publicly proposed a reincarnation of the ether. Einstein said, "More careful reflection teaches us, however, that the special theory of relativity does not compel us to deny ether. Furthermore, he said, we may assume the existence of an ether, only we must give up ascribing a definite state of motion to it. Why the theory of general relativity is wrong. First of all, as I have said in my videos on relativity and special relativity, was that there is no such thing as relativity, or relativity is wrong. Based from this, we can already say that general relativity is wrong. From my discussions, we can get a glimpse of how Einstein had concocted his theory of general relativity. With his erroneous understanding of relativity, he applied this to the feeling of being accelerated and the feeling of gravity, where in the process he replaced gravity with acceleration. The change seems to be subtle. It was done with just the assertion that acceleration feels like gravity, which was not very scientific at that. Nobody argued against this idea of Einstein that we feel our feet pressed on the surface of the earth just as our feet is pressed on the floor of the elevator because of gravity. A person inside a spaceship accelerating in orbit around the Earth do not stand with his feet pressed on what could be the floor of the spaceship, but rather is floating because there is very little gravity. What Einstein did next was to borrow the idea of the Newton's bucket. He removed the motion of the surface of water and make the surface of the water as the ether, which he reincarnated into the fabric of space-time. Einstein then made the body fall in acceleration into the so-called geodesic curve. Thus, Einstein's concoction that a mass could bend the fabric of space-time was an erroneous idea. Just as there was no such thing as ether, there is also no such thing as the fabric of space-time. The fabric of space-time was just a fabric of imagination, no pun intended. Refuting the proofs of general relativity. Refutation of the proofs of the theory of general relativity, such as the orbit of Mercury, gravitational lensing, or the bending of light by gravity, gravitational waves, and black hole, will be discussed later in other videos. Suffice to say that they can be explained as something else, such as the orbit of Mercury or the bending of light by gravity, or refuted as not to exist, such as the gravitational waves and the black hole. I challenge all the brilliant people, physics teachers and professors, scientists, physicists, and especially Nobel laureates in physics, to prove me wrong, or else agree that Einstein's theory of general relativity is wrong.
Please give proper credit to the author for discussion of his ideas and theories. Thank you.